virtually tonight. We have a big night ahead of us because this is the last meeting before we start to dig into our recommendation and work through a draft memo that we will be turning over to the mayor, and we'll do that over the next 2 meetings, subsequent meetings. Last week, we provided feedback on the transformational network and spent most of our time on the cost of that network and the potential funding strategy. Tonight, we'll focus that conversation and look at what could each of those funding strategies yield, and discuss the question, can that get us to the funding necessary in order to fund a bold, transformational mobility network? We will also take some time to look at how we compare to other cities when it comes to some of those funding sources, like the sales tax. Ty is going to share with us some very timely and relevant information about how cities across the country did on Election Day with their transit and transportation ballot initiatives. I'm looking forward to that. But first, if you didn't get a chance to tune in to the October 26th City Council meeting, I did have a chance, along with Ty, to share an update on the work of this task force. And actually, as I looked at what we've done up to now, it's pretty impressive. We haven't had any real fights or anything yet, and it looks like we're moving forward. I shared that the backbone of the Transformational Mobility Network will be transit projects outlined by the CATS 2030 Transit Corridor System Plan, but that network also includes other important forms of mobility which are a part of the network: walking, biking, greenway, buses, and automobiles. And interestingly enough, those plans had been before previous city councils and approved. I think I wanted to make the point that we hadn't tampered with those too much. The fine-tuning, of course, that will take place within the staff perhaps next year. I also shared at this point that we know that the network will not be cheap, because a bold vision for our future will require bold funding. That is what we heard from the cities who spoke to us this summer. The conversation actually went very positively. There were no council members that were, shall we say, unpleasantly surprised by what we were saying, because we told them that there was a general cost range of between $8 and $12 billion spent over a number of years. So I felt good about that, and I felt good about the future for the recommendation that we're going to make to council in December after our final meeting. So before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind the task force members that those of you who are joining us virtually, that there is a digital device or a button that says raise your hand, and that you can use this to participate in the conversation, and I really encourage you to do that. Our support team will be doing their best to monitor the WebEx and ensure that everyone has a chance to chime in. You can also use the chat feature to contribute thoughts as we move along. Ty?
Thank you, Mayor Gantt. Good evening, everyone. I quickly will walk us through the slides, the first couple slides of our presentation tonight. I don't know how many of you noticed that something happened last week called an election. But while you were paying attention
where were you buried? I didn't notice.
While you were paying attention to the other pieces of the results, we were thinking of the transit initiatives that were on the ballot last week as well. We were paying attention to that because we wanted to share the results of those with you today. So Of the 53 initiatives, I think about 47 or so, 92% passed, and they include primarily different revenue types, sales tax, property tax, bond, payroll, but as you see, the majority of them were property tax and sales tax. But I'm not going to go through all of them, but on the next slide, you'll see 6 different communities. Now, we'll stay on this slide for a little bit, but you see 6 different communities: Austin, San Antonio, Seattle, Gwinnett County in Georgia, that's the closest to us, and also Denver. Actually thought another city was there, but what you'll notice is that everyone had different results, but largely that transit or mobility initiatives on the ballot succeeded tremendously, which really has been the trend since 2016, when about 69% passed, and then up until this year where 92% passed, despite the pandemic impact on economics of different communities and individuals. The very one that failed in Gwinnett, even only narrowly failed by about 1,000 votes. My understanding with the people who ran that is that it's actually going to go through a recount, and so we don't know what the final outcome is, but it's very close. And then you'll notice also that those numbers there that you see, those total revenues are by year. So, for example, Austin is $175 million over a period of time, resulting in $7.5 billion in the referendum. The Gwinnett County was about $12.1 billion overall, but it was strictly for transit. San Antonio is 38.5 a year as well. So all those numbers are by year. But you also see that predominantly these were sales tax and property tax, which is not really different from what we had shared with you last time, that while other sources may be there, they're really negligible when you compare them to when you're going big like this, big and bold, you definitely will look at those 2 sources as where you get most bang for your buck. And so some things that we need to think about as we chart our own path as a community is, we heard from Austin back in July when Anik Bode was here to share with us, at least virtually, to share with us what they were looking at, and particularly how they made sure that vulnerable communities and ensuring that equity was part of the whole conversation. And that's kind of almost very similar to the way we are also working on it. If you want, we can provide more background information on each one of these, what went into the calculations and the backstory behind their successes, and also that one failure, depending on what happens over the next week or so while they recount. We don't know if that story will change or not, but I think the most important thing to note there is that mobility initiatives do very well. Regardless of the environment that we're in, that people will actually be supporting $7-some billion in investment, that's a big deal.
Can you share that with us on a few of these?
Yes.
Austin, for example, their total cost was what for the $175 million that they will now raise from property tax a year?
So, I don't have that detail.
Because I thought Austin was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 or $6 billion.
I believe it was about $3 to $7 billion or so.
So they didn't get all of what they're wanting to get then.
Actually, they got everything they had 2 propositions on. Proposition A was $7.1 billion, which was strictly for light rail, 2 light rail corridors, I believe. But out of that was also some $300 million to protect corridors along those light rail from being gentrified. So they provided for affordable housing there. The second proposition was about $430 million, I believe, and that was for non-transit initiatives such as streets and sidewalks and bike paths and all of that. So very similar to what we're looking at, except that they were looking at this in terms of 2 propositions. San Antonio is a little bit different because it was not new money. It was really almost like they were moving money from one to cover another initiative, provided that there was another measure that would go on that would be strictly COVID-19 related. But it was still a big dollar amount strictly to fund transit. At the one that failed in Gwinnett, we haven't done any, I don't think they've done any post-mortem right now to find out what happened, but my understanding is it probably because it was 100% towards public transit, and there was no split between transit and other means of mobility. But again, we'll do more of analysis when we get there. The Seattle piece was more of a larger rail program, which was about $50 billion. $50 billion. Just wanted to repeat that. But again, that's a little bit different. But a couple of things that we may want to pay attention to is, again, the public is very interested in making important connections in urban and regional centers, even during economic crisis. These cities that have taken this step forward successfully are the same cities we're going to be competing with for federal dollars and also for economic development and jobs. And when companies are looking to relocate, they're likely going to be looking at some of these cities. And so any step back for us doesn't bode very well for our city and our region. So a lot to learn from them, but stay tuned. We'll be getting more information for you about any backstory. And I've actually reached out to Austin to see if someone can be here in person to present to our council in January, at least to be able to tell their story. So again, stay tuned. And I will end with that, and we can continue. I'll pass it back on to.
Are there any questions from
question.
anybody here or virtually? Task force members? I would be very curious to know a little bit about the success that occurred in Austin. I think that's the one we studied. Broward County didn't do any because they'd already passed one. And Nashville, I noticed what you had here was $9 billion. They didn't have another initiative this time around, did they?
They're planning. They're actually working on a $1.8 billion transportation initiative right now for 2022.
I see.
Yes.
Okay. Well, the one takeaway for me is our peer cities are, in fact, making investments to improve mobility in their areas. It's almost a no-brainer to say that we have to do the same if we want to keep up. And that's a message that I thought the council took to heart the other day when they realized that whether you agree with this $8 to $12 billion plan, you can't do zero. You got to do something to begin this process. Okay? Let's move on then to item 2, the outcomes of the Transformational Mobility Network. And Stephen, glad you're here, and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Welcome to those of you who are participating virtually. Just a quick follow-up on what we saw a moment ago. It's kind of interesting. There's no perfect comparison community to community, but talking about Austin order of operations, they just completed their comprehensive plan entitled Imagine Austin, followed by Project Connect, which was a high-capacity transit plan, followed by their strategic mobility plan. In order of operations, that essentially allowed them as a community to better understand what their needs were, better understand the influence of investments, so that they could build a coalition of support. It's not too dissimilar from the circumstances that we find ourselves in here, because it's very exciting to know that we have a draft comprehensive plan. Mine's on my iPad. I hope you guys get a chance to take a look at it. It was released in draft format. It's online if you want to take a look at it. It's cltfuture2040.com. And I bring that up primarily because I think a number of the things that we've aspired to create through the Transformational Mobility Network really are a derivative of that upswell of community support and analysis. There's over like 5,000 different participants during that process with over 500,000 individual data points of input. So this has not been taken lightly. There's been a lot of work that's gotten us to this point today. So the last time we got together, I shared with you an example from Seattle, which was an outcome of what their investment network was going to generate, and committed to you that over that following 2-week period of time, we would do our best to generate some similar information. While we certainly could analyze things 1,000 different ways, in the interest of time, we wanted to show you some highlights. I might even just suggest that these are characteristics of the Transformational Mobility Network. So I'm going to jump into that with your permission and maybe just help us better understand what we should expect about that. Now, before I do so, I just want to clarify so that there's some fundamental understandings about what you're to see, that one of the things we needed to do to better isolate the influence of the Transformational Mobility Network, which I'm going to call the TMN for the remainder of this presentation, is to establish a baseline. We needed to know what the influence of our existing multimodal investments are before we can better isolate what future investments might do for us. So I'll make a couple of comparisons throughout the few pieces of information I'll share with you, just so that we've got some comparisons. The other thing I want to point out, in the center of this slide, you'll notice there's kind of a description of how we measured it. I won't go into a lot of detail, but suffice it to say we used a variety of analytic methods, some fancy spatial analysis, and leveraged every current data set we could get our hands on. And I'm really appreciative to the folks at the MPO and the city staff, county, and others to help make that information available to us in such quick order. It really helped our process. Something else that I want to point out, in almost all the metrics I'm going to share with you, we're looking into the future. It's not just today, that's our baseline, but we're looking into the future. And selecting a future date with which to evaluate is really best done by looking at your data. And most of the data that we have forecast for takes us all the way out to the year 2050. So when I talk about a future year, I'm talking about 2050. And that's an agreed upon methodology where we're applying best practices, and that's kind of the foundation for what we're going to do. Now lastly, we don't have time to maybe go through absolutely everything that could be generated in terms of analytics about the TMN's performance, but we do want to be sure that we're bringing back to you the things you told us were already important to you. If you recall in past meetings, there were a number of planning themes that were discussed, but you pointed out that health and safety were some of your top priorities, that equity and access to opportunity were high priorities, and regional growth and connectivity. And so with that understanding, I'm going to stay focused on those kinds of indicators. So let's jump into it. All these slides are going to look very similar, so once I get you oriented to the first slide, the ones that follow will be that much more easy to read. So when we think about health, you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, this says TMN evaluation, and the topic area is health. There's a variety of things that we can measure associated with that. We thought it might be interesting, though, to create that crosswalk back to the comprehensive plan. That references a number of objectives. And so some of the things that we're measuring were direct objectives within the comprehensive plan. And so I'll read to you that first one, 1A from the comp plan, was to increase access to fresh, healthy food opportunities. One of the things that our community struggles with, like many large cities, is simply access to healthy food. And so there's some easy ways with which we can measure that. This is the easiest thing for us to measure. And we do so by contemplating what we have today in terms of access to grocery stores in particular through our existing multimodal networks. So when we contemplate affordability, choice, and opportunity, we have to consider how we might navigate that trip. And right now, about 56% of our grocery stores fall within a half-mile radius of our current multimodal investments. It's not a bad number. But what we're able to demonstrate when we advance the Transformational Mobility Network is that that number will jump to 89%. And I just want to point out, it jumps to 89% just measuring today's grocery stores. Obviously, new ones will be built. And I'm going to show you some evidence to suggest that they're probably going to be built near these Transformational Mobility Networks. But that's a 57% increase. And certainly this one measure alone isn't motivation enough. And so I want to also take a more global look at this, because one of the other objectives that was mentioned in the comprehensive plan really has to do with the environment. It also has to do with how we move about our city. So we could have put this next one, which deals with vehicle miles traveled, in a variety of categories, but really felt like it was a huge influence over the health of our community. And so the next one is essentially measuring vehicle miles traveled, the amount of them that would be reduced as a result of investing in the creation of new opportunities to travel, multimodal investments that create new choices. And so we know if we build out, in particular, our emphasis on the transit piece of the TMN, what kind of influence it can make. I'd love to be able to measure the influence on all of it, but one of the tools that we used was actually published by the Federal Transit Administration. So we wanted to isolate that investment. It's also one of the largest investments in the TMN, if you recall. But we know if we build that out, we have the opportunity to reduce VMT, vehicle miles traveled, by 13%. And that might not be a big number to some of you. I'll tell you in what I do for a living, if you can move it 3 and 5 and 6%, those are huge numbers, especially in communities where our mode share is really so dominated by cars. But I have a hyphen on this one. It says 13 to 40% reduction. So you're probably wondering, how in the world does he have a range on this one? So if we contemplate the investment in infrastructure and think about that as transportation supply, that's only one part of the equation. The other piece of the equation is really about the demand, right? People, jobs, trips. That's demand. In communities where we better integrate the supply of transportation choice with future growth and land use objectives, we actually see VMT enjoy a much greater opportunity for reduction. So it's really important because the timing, I come back, this is the reason I'm so happy. We've got a comprehensive plan. It's going to help steer and direct and manage our growth over time so that it works for us rather than working against us. And so we can look at this particular slide and recognize that there's work to be done, not just to advance the infrastructure that's represented by the Transformational Mobility Network, but also to ensure that the policy aligns with that investment so that we enjoy the fullest benefit possible. Let's take a look at the next one. Contemplating safety. There's a lot of things here again that we can be measuring related to that. I've chosen 2 for tonight. We mentioned in past meetings a reference to Vision Zero, which is a policy that the city holds like many other cities around the country. It's a movement, quite frankly, to state as a goal the reduction to 0 fatalities. Now, for some, obviously there's a lot of challenges with ever imagining getting to that point. The point is, though, to work towards it so that we are making incremental investments and policy changes and design changes so that things improve over time. But we've done a lot of work here as a community to better understand where our greatest safety challenges reside. So much so that if you recall in the State of the Mobility Report, there's a section on health and safety. And there's a pretty profound statistic that I shared with you in past meetings that stated that 100% of all of our severe crashes and fatalities occurs on just 10% of Charlotte's streets. It's pretty profound. So we thought we might turn that into a metric, right? How does the Transformational Mobility Network create opportunities to make that situation better? So one of the things that we evaluated was where those crashes were occurring. That's considered the high injury network, the HIN up there. And essentially, when we overlay that with the corridors represented by the Transformational Mobility Network, we find that 57% of the high injury network is overlapping with the Transformational Mobility Network. That's 189 miles. Now, I'm not here to suggest that we're going to mitigate and eliminate all of those crashes. But what we're excited about is that if we know we're going to be touching these corridors in some way, making investments in them, that generates the opportunity to make improvements on safety as a part of those investments. So we should expect that we will see improvement in those corridors when we do our work correctly. And that's a unique opportunity that otherwise would not occur. Now, the other side of this is contemplating the safe accommodation for different travel modes. And we could isolate any one of them that we wanted, but I wanted to point out bicycle facilities in particular. And so you'll see on the slide here to the right, and I apologize for those of you here in the room, I think it's a little bit difficult to read, but on the bottom right, you'll note that it says that 56% of our population has access within a half mile of a dedicated bicycle facility. All right, that's under the Transformational Mobility Network. When we compare that to today, we're only at 39%. So this kind of network investment yields a 41% increase on people that would reside within a half mile of a dedicated bicycle facility. This is really important because if you recall listening to Scott Curry in past meetings, he's talked about an all ages and ability network. Right now, if we have bike routes that are unprotected bike lanes, it attracts a certain kind of rider. But when we have dedicated lanes that have protected characteristics to them, we broaden the diversity of people that feel comfortable making that trip. Let's continue on.
I'll go back a minute.
Sure.
39% today are within a half mile of dedicated bike facilities.
Mm-hmm.
The TMN gets it up to 41.
Gets it up to 56. Gets it up to 56%, which is a 41% increase, just to clarify. Okay?
Go ahead.
All right, so the next topic area is dealing with equity. And we grouped equity and access to opportunity together, not because they're the same thing, but they are directly related to each other. And we've spent a lot of time talking to you, especially through the state of mobility, about the differentiations of what happens within the ARC and what happens outside of the ARC. And to that end, it's really important for us to ensure that we're isolating the influence of the Transformational Mobility Network in places that we know have traditionally been underserved. And to that end, a little bit of information about just the population that happens to fall in the ARC within a half mile of some kind of multimodal facility. Right now, it's about 58% in the bottom right of that graph. It's a good number, but it's not a great number, and it's certainly not doing its job, because what we found through the state of mobility was that we have a number of challenges right now, ranging from affordability to safety to choice, housing cost, and the like. And so when we overlaid the Transformational Mobility Network, we wanted to see what percentage of the population in the ARC would have access to these new investments. And as it turns out, when we implement the TMN, 92% of the future population within the ARC is going to be served by the TMN in conjunction with the current multimodal system. It's probably the most transformational statistic that we can generate for that particular geography at this point in time. That's a 56% increase in service to the ARC.
So 9 out of 10 people in those neighborhoods will now have an opportunity to get on the network.
Yeah.
There's a question from Carl. Carl, is it related to any of these slides up here? Carl?
Just a quick question. You know, on the previous slide, you said dedicated bicycle facilities. It's just a definition. Are those bike lanes, greenways, and cycle tracks?
They are.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So following that same kind of thought, and certainly investigating further about the geography within the Transformational Mobility Network's influence on the ARC, we thought it would be important to look at low-wage jobs within a half mile of the TMN. And right now, when we think about low-wage jobs, defined as jobs paying less than $1,250 per month, about 43% of those jobs are currently accessible via some other means than driving, which is not a great number, which is one of the reasons why we're having many of our struggles. When we overlay the Transformational Mobility Network and analyze proximity to serving those existing jobs, we find that we're increasing this to a point of 91% of those jobs being served by a combination of the new network and the existing system. And that here again is another large increase. The delta between those results in 111% increase from what we're currently experiencing today. These two things are profound. They're not the only things to measure clearly, but kind of mining through the data, we felt like those were worthy of bringing to your attention. Now, regional growth and connectivity encompasses a lot of things. Quite frankly, we've got to be responsible for ensuring a vibrant economy. It's the thing that ties us all together. And we also know that there's a lot of work that goes behind understanding what kind of job growth is likely to occur in our region and our community, and where those jobs are likely to reside. So we've got a certain degree of confidence about how many jobs will be here in the future, and generally we have an opportunity to steer where those jobs may be located. And so we evaluated the influence of the Transformational Mobility Network to access those new jobs, not existing, but new jobs. And what we found is that this isn't our data. Like, we didn't make this forecast. This is a forecast based on our transportation models for the region, that when implementing the Transformational Mobility Network, we'll be providing access within a half mile to 90% of the future jobs within Charlotte. Now, you can read into that a lot. So I'm going to put all kinds of disclaimers on that. I don't have a crystal ball. But one of the things we do know is that we happen to choose corridors that are popular to the market. We happen to choose corridors that had opportunities to increase the carrying capacity of jobs. The other thing about this is that when we think about how we accommodate the growth of our community, one of the things that oftentimes you'll find when talking with citizens is they like the idea of new choices, but they really don't always want their choices to change. Some really like things the way they currently exist. In other words, don't make me change what I choose to do. So when I look at a statistic like this, what we see is that if we clustered jobs near where we're investing in multimodal infrastructure, we stand a much greater chance at capturing future growth to travel in ways other than driving, which is a benefit to folks who want to continue to drive. It's less competition on the roadway, if you will. So it's good planning. It's smart of us to be thinking in that way. I think the other thing that's worth noting is, similarly, new population growth within a half mile likewise ends up being about 68%. So when we compare the forecasted population growth, this is new additional people moving here to our community, 68% of those folks are forecasted to live within a half mile of the Transformational Mobility Network. So if we cluster the increment of new growth in terms of population as well as jobs close to these corridors, the value proposition here is that we stand a much higher propensity for those individuals, those workers, to use the investment that we're making in the Transformational Mobility Network. And with that, I'm going to pause for a moment, see if there's any questions before we jump into funding strategy.
Any questions?
See any question?
No questions here? Everybody happy? When you talk about that jobs growth thing and 90% of the people being within a half mile of our network, that would also include people who are aspiring to do something more than getting a low-wage job too, right?
That's correct, and that really speaks to the access to opportunity, Mayor. It's one thing to continue to improve conditions for low-wage jobs, but upward mobility is largely influenced by folks being able to migrate out of those jobs into a better opportunity. And one of the greatest barriers to that isn't what you always think it might be. Sometimes it is education, but more often than not, it's about opportunity. And when you ask questions about opportunity, it's about access, transportation. And so we open up new doors for people in terms of what they can aspire to do to help support themselves and their families when we increase access to those future opportunities.
Okay.
Did you have, okay.
Comments from anyone?
Question.
Kiba?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have a question, it's more of a comment. I'm glad, Stephen, that you presented this particular set of slides and we can kind of overlay the comp plan. I have been exposed to the comp plan for, I don't know, nearly 2 years now in some shape, form, or fashion. And we've always known that transportation or mobility in general would be an important piece, but I think that this helps me and will probably help many council members realize that these two priorities are not competing. They're complementary in a way, almost interdependent. The transformational mobility network and the comp plan. And this presentation almost makes that crystal clear. Thank you.
That's great. I appreciate the observation. I like your term. They are interdependent, and we should probably speak about them as if they are for that very reason.
Can you, maybe if you could, I think I saw someone online say that they didn't hear that very well. So do you want to rehash what Kiba just said? I'll repeat that. Okay.
Do I need to turn something on? I was just commenting that I'm glad to see this presentation and the way that you put it together. In studying the comp plan and many discussions with Planning Commission and with planning staff, I think that the way that this presentation has come across to me, and I think it will definitely help us as we're basically selling this, right, for council and essentially to the public, that the comp plan, which is much needed, is not a competing priority to the transformational mobility network. They're interdependent. They depend on each other. They're complementary. And that presentation helped to, for me, make that crystal clear.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions? Sonia?
Yeah, Stephen, one of the slides you showed talked about was 68% of new folks coming in. One of those slides showed it was 68% new people coming into the area. Is that correct?
Population growth.
Do you mind taking this slide back?
The question I have in reference to that 68% of total future population growth, do we have, and I may have missed it, it's probably somewhere, but do we have, as far as affordable housing is concerned, I mean, when we start looking at a dedicated amount of, when you start looking at a footprint, when you're looking at 68% of total future population, how is affordable housing factored, or is it factored into that?
Sonia, I love it you're asking that. I don't have what that number is because we have the opportunity to set that, right?
Okay.
So what you're speaking to is very similar to what you were just referencing earlier about the interrelationship between our policy and the investment. If we do a good job, it's not just about the efficiency of the transportation network, it's about the effectiveness of its integration with the things that matter to us most at this moment in time. And so I love your question because effectively what seems to come to mind is that we might want to direct some of that affordable housing investment directly in line with the transformational mobility network, right? So that we're not just creating affordability in isolation, but that we're creating affordability in terms of access to opportunity. And it almost begs the question, you know, can we help guide that over time through these conversations to ensure that we don't lose out on the opportunity to bring synergies between those policy initiatives?
Other questions?
No.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. We'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is the Can they hear me? Oh, someone? All right.
Thank you.
This is Willie. I have a quick question. And I like the way that you laid it out as well. And I think it's hard to touch on local mobility a few moments ago. And I would like to see a slide which we can target top into local mobility, especially when it comes to job growth in areas that are going to be closer to transit delivery options, and how that's going to move the needle when it comes to local mobility. I think that's something that the council has been stressing pretty vigorously, and being able to illustrate how some of the recommendations that we'll be making will change that trajectory, I think, will be helpful.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Without any further ado, I may encourage that we migrate into some more discussions about dollars and cents. So I've got to my right, again, I'm joined by Kelly Flannery. She's the city's chief financial officer. She's been checking our math along the way. Thank you, Kelly. But we obviously owe you a little bit more information. So if you recall during our last meeting, I used this graphic to describe primarily the difference between what the task force is responsible for and what happens after the task force, post-task force activities, specific to how we pay for things. And one of the things that we pointed out was that the mayor charged us with the responsibility of developing a funding strategy. And we've been listening and learning along the way by talking with folks like Kelly and others to better understand what a finance and funding plan would look like so that our strategy is helpful. So I know that might feel a little bit backwards, but it's been incredibly helpful for us to better understand what that finance and funding plan needs to be so that the things that we're recommending to the mayor and council and the manager's office are on par with what they're expecting. So a few of the things that we hit on during our last meeting was that we needed to not only identify a program, but we needed to get fairly specific about the scale of that program. And if you recall, we started talking about the Transformational Mobility Network as a funding program to advance these projects that we think are important to our future. We also needed to understand what our current funding looks like to support these investments in multimodal accommodations in our community. And the delta between what it cost to build the Transformational Mobility Network and our current revenue stream clearly becomes our gap. And we've got to figure out a way to cover that gap. And that causes us to investigate what we have access to in the way of increased revenue streams or new revenue streams, and that's our funding menu. So just wanted to remind you of that and also remind you that we're going to be stopping short of getting into details associated with that finance and funding plan. Quite frankly, we need the wisdom of council, manager's office to help guide those decisions because they're not done in isolation. And Kelly will bring us a little bit more information about what those look like. But then I thought more about our next conversation that we'd be having with you tonight and realizing that, well, categorically, that's really helpful. We needed to put a little bit more meat on the bone. And so it was one thing to talk about what our program scale might be, our Transformational Mobility Network, but we also need to contemplate what time duration we would expect that investment might take place. And we also needed to put a number against the cost of the program, which we've already done with you. And we needed you to have a greater understanding of what our revenue potential might be for funding sources that would be used to pay for this program. And so we're going to do that tonight, and hopefully we hit close to the mark. And I hope that you have some really good questions for us. But I want to start very quickly by just hitting some of the easy things with you before turning things over to Kelly. So one of the things that we mentioned when we contemplated the time and duration is that this doesn't happen overnight. Some of these are really big projects. You know, just simply the design of them can take several years. Acquiring the right-of-way necessary can take time. But we have an aggressive program. We're talking about it in terms of at a minimum 10-year program. Get as much done in the first 10 years, make as big a difference, as big an impact as possible in that first 10 years. But it also means it's going to take a lot of time to pay that back. When you buy a home, for example, you don't pay for it all up front. If you're lucky, you can take a 10-year loan, but more often than not, many of us are taking 20 and 30-year loans. That's essentially what we're doing here. So the exact time frame with which the program would be in place is largely going to be influenced by that detailed financial plan and construction program. But I just wanted to point out that that would be the time duration. When we talk about the program scale and the amount, just to remind you, the Transformational Mobility Network, as described, is estimated to cost between $8 and $12 billion. And we all know why it's a range. We know that there's some things in there that will require further study, and as those studies are conducted, we get more precise with our numbers. When we have designs, we have greater confidence in those estimates. But we don't have to take on the burden of the entire program on our own. We're fortunate to have partners. And so our local portion is likely half that $4 to $6 billion. And that program cost needs to include design, construction, operation and maintenance, and also the financing costs. We don't have 0% interest, right? We actually have some costs associated with financing the project as well. Now, the funding sources. We spent a lot of time during our last meeting just getting up to speed about what the likely funding sources would be for a program of this scale. And the new sources largely fall into two influential buckets: the transit sales tax and dedicated property tax. But we also know, as I mentioned earlier, that a large portion of that total cost, almost 50%, would be state and federal, right? And so there's some assumptions that go into that as well. And then we have some existing resources that we program annually through the Capital Improvement Program. One of the things that we've said about this Transformational Mobility Network and Charlotte Moves as an initiative is to be profound, to be impactful, to be transformational. We know that it's not just about building things. Some of this is about changing the way we do business, modernizing the way we do business. In this instance, we're suggesting that we would align our current CIP to reflect the priorities of the Transformational Mobility Network and really work those details out during the strategic mobility plan that follows. And so with that, we're at a point now where we need to learn a little bit more about some of the details associated with each of these funding sources. Before we do that, Mayor Gantt.
Stephen, before you get into that, I think we had a question. What was it, Carlos?
Yes, so Pedro has a comment.
Pedro.
Bill has a question.
Pedro, then Bill.
Yes, my question is that I'm extremely happy that the matrix of this includes equity, affordable housing, and upward mobility. I am concerned that the resident tax, it impacts poor people more and more directly than those that are making significant amount of money. Will there be an offset by reducing the fares that these folks that are at or below the poverty line may have to pay to use public transportation? That's my concern. Thank you.
Good question, Pedro. That's something that we ought to discuss as a committee. How do we make the sales tax less regressive in its impact on poor people? And there are a number of ways you could do that. We can discuss that as we get into the details of that, okay?
I'm going to ask.
Who's the other?
And then Bill.
Bill? Oh, I'm sorry. That's Jim. That's not
Okay.
Bill.
Well,
Do I think?
I've got two quick ones. One's actually related to the last question. Stephen, when you were reviewing the numbers, you mentioned that operations and maintenance were included in those costs. I guess one of the things I wanted to understand is how much of the fare is subsidized, and that kind of plays into the last question. But how much of that operations cost and maintenance cost is covered by the fares today or is projected to going forward, because it plays into how much we may want to subsidize things, may or may not. And then my other question was on the statement about property tax. Is that, or does that include vehicle property taxes as well, or just physical,
Jim, you've
land
influenced the
homes?
content of our presentation tonight, so we've got a few things I think that will begin to address some of those ideas. And to be very specific, I don't have exact numbers on what the fare box collection rates are for transit, but Kelly may be able to help us out with that because she's been keeping track of these sorts of things. Maybe if we could, just go ahead and allow me to transition to Kelly so that she can offer us what she knows about each of these, and then if there's some additional questions, we can come back around. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thanks to the task force for letting me be a resource here tonight. And that there's no way to not make this choppy, so I think we're going to respond to some questions we got the last time I was here, as well as some you just raised. And I think the best way to do that is to just maybe knock out what we've got so far. And when you talk about fare box, obviously all we can talk about is CATS, right? It's not the whole program, but if you look at the CATS budget, probably about $200 million a year, and probably 15% of that revenue is fare box revenue. So as we're looking forward on to how we're going to subsidize or set fare rates, and this is not special to Charlotte, fare box never covers costs. I mean, it never comes close. And I think we're probably right in the wheelhouse, but that's kind of far down the road, right? Until we actually know the alignment, how far this is going, the ridership, I think it's premature to make assumptions on what the O&M fare box could be. But if we wanted to just use the existing 15%, I think that's a nice conservative approach. And then your second question was vehicle tax. We'll get there. That's another slide. So this slide is in response to Mayor Gantt's request last time about the existing half-cent sales tax and what have we seen been produced as that. So in 1998, we went to referendum. I did a little homework. 58% approval on that referendum result in 1998. That in 2000 resulted in the half-cent implementation. Right now, we're collecting about $110 million a year off of that. We've seen a growth rate of about 3.58%. And any modeling that we've done for these presentations that we'll see in the subsequent slides, we're not assuming any of that growth. It is just, we're assuming $110 million into perpetuity into the next 30 years. When we actually get into the weeds and have alignments and schedules figured out, we will start to apply some of that more technical math to things. So I think that is about all we wanted to show on this, is just how the existing growth has occurred. I think everyone knows, sorry, real quick, the use of that money is for...
Before you go to the next one, though, Kelly,
Sure.
That is a half-cent dedicated totally to transit.
Mm-hmm.
What is the sales tax that the average Charlottean pays today? I guess I should know that if I buy a loaf of bread, but...
So that is a nice transition to the next slide. I love it when we do this. So you'll see the city, when looking at its peer cities, is actually fairly low in sales tax rate. The 7.25 is comprised of 4.75 that is the state of North Carolina percent, 2% is collected by Mecklenburg County, and then the half is the public transit tax, getting into the 7.25%. And while 7.25 is extremely low, there are, I should identify, 2 states on this comparable cities list that do not have income tax, personal income tax. But even excluding those, we are still well below our peers in the comparable sales tax rates.
Those 2 states are what, Florida?
On this list is Texas and Tennessee. I think the other ones are, I don't know. If you had asked me the other day, I could have told you, but I can't tell you today.
7.25% puts us down at the bottom, right?
At the bottom, yep.
And again, I think we should remind ourselves that these also are cities that are doing something right now with mobility. Either they've just done it or they've done it recently. Whether they failed or not, they constantly have it in the back, at the very back of their minds. As a matter of fact, of all of this, even though Raleigh did not move forward with its Orange Durham light rail, but that was not because the community did not want it, but it was simply because of the issue they had with one of the stakeholders, which was Duke
yeah.
University. So again, we know we have the best university in this state, right here in Charlotte.
If we can back up, I think we kind of glossed. I think we glossed over the concept that Ty was trying to prove, and even at the 7.25, we're still well below our peers on the percent that is dedicated to trains at only 0.5%. And I think it shows that there is room to be more committed to the cause.
The other point I want to make about that, only 0.5%, is that it's been 20 years that we have done well with the 0.5 cent.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it seems to me that that's a good point to be made, that we have not treated that sales tax in a loose way. That is coming back every year when we run into any problems if we did. So even adding a 0.5 cent maybe down the road is not too bad to say. 20 years later, we want to go to build a transformational mobility network. We might have to ask for a full penny from our citizens.
You have a question over
Maybe
here.
that's a talking point down there.
Mayor, I think you have a question over here.
There's a question, Nick. Nick has a question.
One of the problems I'm having is looking at the screen. Mayor, please, yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Question for Kelly. Kelly, what is the maximum tax rate you can charge sales tax in North Carolina from the legislature? Do you know what that is?
So I think it's different for every municipality, but we are at our cap as a city, and we would have to go back to the state and ask for approval to raise that. I don't think I'm making things up now. I don't know if there's a cap. How about I rescind I know we need, as a city, we have to go back for more authority. I don't know if there's one magic number that exists on the books.
Okay, thank you.
That's a nice way of saying the cap is what the legislature allows.
Yes.
Enabling legislation to allow that. Yes.
I have a question, kind of piggybacking on what you were talking about, and has been a thought to, as I'm pumping gas. I mean, in the past, right now the prices are so low, I'm not complaining. But when the prices were pretty high, I was thinking, my God, this tax on the gas here, how long are we supposed to have this, and when is it gonna, go away? And so in thinking about what you said about going to the penny sounds nice and round, but what I was thinking was, is there a way that, or does it make sense? I may be totally off base with this, but would it make sense, or could it make sense that we had, say that for this particular period of time, we're gonna go to the penny? And then once that period of time is up, we can kind of, the mathematicians can figure out, okay, if we do a penny for this amount of time, this is how much money we can generate to take care of these projects, these capital projects, and get them done. And then after that's over, I know it's kind of hard to put the genie back in the bottle, but really be honest with people and up front and say, okay, guys, we need to do this right now and buckle down. Like I tell my children, we got to buckle down right now. But then once we've gotten past this rough space, then we can kind of bring it back.
You mean you want to make sure this is a sunrise, sunset situation?
Exactly.
We take it out when we don't need it. I'm not going to answer that because that's why we give these kinds of things ultimately to the city council. The truth of the matter is, we don't know 30 years from now or 10 years from now, there will be some additional needs that might not allow us to take back that half cent that we added. But
Yeah.
it is possible to do that.
I can give
Okay,
you an
I get, and
example.
having said that, and in being honest with people, okay, you could say, all right, this is what we're gonna do for this period of time. And then when that future date comes, 2050 or whatever that magic date is Stephen was talking about, if our needs change, then go back to the people again at that point and say, hey, okay, we kept our word, you got it back, but can we revisit this? Because these are our needs now.
So York County, South Carolina has a program called Pennies for Progress, and I think it's a 1% sales tax, and it's over a 7-year period, and it's designated for roads, but it's the magnitude because you're essentially pay-go, you're just cash funding at a 7-year project. So if we didn't have so many zeros on the end of our project, I think that would be something that would be more palatable, and maybe it's something we could do on the property tax side, carving out a piece, maybe it's the bike lanes or something like that. But when we're talking about a magnitude as large as a transit system, we're gonna need that long 20, 30-year financing period to make bills or whatever. If we tried to shorten that duration, it would be a lot more than pennies. It would be very large numbers.
Maybe Mayor can say something, but I also know that Kiva has a question, and so does Ken. I wonder if, before Kiva, if we could go back to that last slide, maybe it's important to kind of put out there the message that we've been at this rate for the last 20 years, and there's only so many times you can go to the well, right? So even if you go with a penny now, and you want to go in another 5 years, or you have to wait for another 20 years to go. And so if you're doing something transformational, you want to make sure that when you have the opportunity, but then it's very important to be transparent with the community, however way we choose to do this. So I get that.
And
So,
another point, to your point, Ty, while we financed the Blue Line, 20 or 30 years, and we use most of that money to pay that back and to pay Gold Line, well, now those things that we purchased 10 and 20, 30 years ago, those rail cars, their maintenance costs are increasing. So it's not like we have a super secret windfall of free cash. And now it's going into maintaining the system.
Let's see. Kiva?
Kiva, and then Ken.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was wondering, Kelly, do you have, if we could go back to the city rankings? Wondering if you have this same data and a percentage that the transit tax is of the sales tax. Like what percentage of our transit tax?
It's a half. It's that middle column.
It's the middle column.
Okay. And then is there a way to Ty's point, add in like the last time these cities did increases?
Sure, we could do that.
Because that's a very relevant point. How long have we been at the same
That's good.
rate?
That's good, Keith.
Let me see. Is it
Ken.
Bill?
Ken.
Ken, and then Elias. Ken. All right. Elias, I don't hear Ken, so.
My question went way back to Ty's opening, about 15 or 18 in the past, and the biggest one that failed was in Portland, Oregon, and they were trying to do it through an employer payroll tax, and it was very similar to our size. It was for $7 billion continuation of their existing rapid mass transit. So I think we can learn things from that as to, what type of tax might be more palatable than others. Of the 15 of 18 that passed, most of them were bond referendums like ours was here in North Carolina, but the ones that did pass were based on sales tax. The only comment I made was that the sales tax, you start looking at hospitality tax and sales tax, prepared food, and so 7.25, is the tax if you're buying clothes or something like that. But, if you're at a restaurant or a hotel, that number goes up to either, 8.25 or, upwards of 11% in hospitality. So there are a lot of different tax rates depending on what product you're buying.
That's true. Ernie? I'm sorry, Ilias.
General public, right? So in the past slides, Stephen, we have seen there will be a 90% commute to jobs and all that stuff, right? So is there any opportunity to levy some taxes on the businesses and corporations popping up in the city and surrounding the city instead of general public collecting the taxes? Can we go for the corporations too?
Maybe I can jump in there. I don't know what our state allows, but when Ken brought up the example of Portland, that's why it failed. Because they were levying it on corporations like Nike and all the big corporations, and it failed. And I think they even had it tied to the number of employees per company. If your company is about 250 people or more, you are going to be taxed, and it's going to be a lot of money. But that was a major reason that it failed, because even smaller businesses went against it because of the ripple effect of that on the community. So now I don't know what North Carolina legislature will allow for when it comes to that, but that's probably something we can take a look at what Portland did, but they failed that referendum.
We have Ernie.
The only point I was just going to reiterate what you said earlier, that if we're going to increase the sales tax in Charlotte, I think we're going to have to deal with the legislature, and that will take time too.
Definitely.
We also have Carl. Carl has a comment.
All right, let me take Jim and then
Okay.
Carl. You said?
Yes.
So going back to either our second or third meeting, I had asked about priorities and whether existing priorities that we felt that were already funded, that we felt as though this was more important than, that perhaps we could allocate some or all of that funding to this. I realize that's not going to replace all of the cost of this, but looking at a percentage of this, if we could fund 5 or 10% of this from something that's existing, already funded, then that might be somewhere. So I asked the question in either our second or third meeting. I was told at that point in time that the staff would investigate. I haven't heard anything since. I don't expect to hear something tonight, but I still think that that's something that should be considered. If this is as important as I think everybody here believes, myself included, then at some point we're going to make choices to say this is maybe more important than something else. Just to be I love this format, because a lot of what you're seeing today is directly influenced by the comments and the questions that you make. We did go back. We took a look at it, and Ed McKinney's here tonight, and I know that Ty has helped out with this, and we've really began examining the capital improvement program to see, is that something that we would reprioritize and just bring it in direct alignment with this initiative. And it just seems to make a lot of sense. So when we fast forward through a few slides, I want to come back to your comment because it now is represented as a line item. And to the extent that we need it to be completely reprioritized is another discussion, but it theoretically seems like it's good practice for us to bring alignment between our comprehensive plan, our housing strategy, our mobility strategy, and then this program, to be sure that we're all hitting on the same cylinders so that we are moving the needle to the greatest extent possible and making each dollar that we spend to do as much towards moving those needles on the indicators that matter to us most. So let's come back to that, and I appreciate you bringing it up.
Carl?
we've looked into this sales tax and we're limited at 7.5, so I'm just confirming that. And as far as pennies for progress, I've worked with the folks down there several times, and it's a fairly small amount over the 23 years that it's been in existence. At 1 cent sales tax, it's generated about $700 million. So it's about $30–40 million a year is what they generate, which is fine for York County and what they're doing, but it's not going to make much of a difference even on extending some of the roads in South Carolina into North Carolina, like Highway 160 or 49. It just doesn't move the needle enough in Charlotte.
Well,
Thank you.
you tell me a half cent is now generating $107 million,
Yeah,
Kelly?
107.7. That's actually a lot more than I would have thought York County would have generated, so good for them.
Continue.
Kelly, do you want to hit on what this may equate to if we were to contemplate a change?
I'm sorry?
The sales tax, this slide here.
Oh, sure. So this was just throwing in, and it could be 25%, it could be a 0.5%, it could be, 75, whatever it is. This is just 3 arbitrary numbers that I think we talked about in this room before. So if we were to add 0.25%, so taking it from 7.25 to 7.5% would generate $55 million a year. Another 0.5%, so 7.25 to 7.75, $110 million. Adding a full percent, so 7.25 to 8.25 would kick out $220 million. And I almost wish we could toggle back to that comparable cities again, because I'm saying if you add a full 1%, $220 million a year, you are still below 2/3 of our comparable cities. And then you would be at 1.5% of the portion going to transit, which would move you way up on the transit portion chart. If we could have done this again, I would have shown a before and after of this comparable cities chart, but.
You can also see how that extrapolated out over 20 or 30 years. Your 1% means X in 20 years or whatever.
Yeah, and so there's a kind of summary chart that we have at the end, but like I said, in that summary chart, we are assuming no growth, and we will when we get there, but it was just, kind of to prove the concept that there's money here in this concept.
All right.
You guys ready to look at another revenue stream?
I'm sorry, Ernie? You're okay, you said?
Yes.
Okay. Kelly, let's continue.
Okay, so this contemplates a dedicated property tax increase, and this is just the city impact. So while we would hope the county would be a partner, didn't want to be that presumptuous, so this is just an increase to city property tax. So right now, the city property tax rate is 0.3481, and this would be just adding 1 cent to that. So from 0.3481 to 0.3581 generates about $14 million. Just for curiosity, if we were to include the county, that would add about another $4 million, so that 14 would be $18 million. So on the average property tax bill for the average home in the city of Charlotte, that would be $21.48 increase to their bill, bringing it from $21.72 to $20.94. And just for fun, that's about a 2.88% increase annually to a property tax bill by raising 1 cent. If you want to look at your total tax bill, the county and the city portion, that 2.88% is actually only a 1% increase to your property tax bill. So for 1 cent, you get 14 million, costs you 21.48. And again, you could use any number you want. This is just basic math. 1 cent gets you 14, 2 cents gets you 28. You could go out as far as you wanted. At that 4% rate, that's about an 11% increase in your city bill, but only a 4% increase in your overall city-county combined property tax bill. And this, obviously, raising property taxes doesn't require any approval from the state, doesn't require voter referendum. It would just require city council approval. If we were to borrow off of it, of course, it would require a voter referendum.
Let me ask this question. If it required city council approval, can a subsequent or a later council decide that they don't want to fund this anymore? It's not dedicated in the sense that it's there for 30 years.
They could, but if we had already borrowed the debt, they would be then,
Obligated.
you know, unless they want to send the city into default. But, you know, I don't even know if they would even have the authority to do that. I think they probably have a fiduciary responsibility to maintain coverage, so.
I'm answering my own question. I should have known that.
Yeah.
I would have asked you to answer that question, actually.
I realize that.
I want to make a point here.
That's a crazy question.
I want to make a point real quick here. You'll notice at the bottom of these slides, you'll see that the reason we're talking about both of these again in conjunction is that the transit sales tax, I know this is obvious, but I want to point it out, can only be used for the transit portion of the transformational mobility network. So it's not as if we get the luxury of finding one revenue source that will meet all of our needs. And so, like all things in life, it's a little bit complicated, but when we look to the property tax, you'll notice that the bars on the bottom, these are our buckets, if you recall. We kept talking about the transformational mobility network, the categories of investments. It covers the complement of the network outside of transit. So our roadways, bike, ped, and greenways would be covered by this, and all other sources as well.
So it has to be a combination. It cannot
Correct.
just be one. Okay.
That's only because of the precedent of having the half cent dedicated to transit right now. But if you went to get enabling legislation and you wanted that to cover all forms of transit, transportation and movement, could you then have a one sales tax that covered everything?
I mean, theoretically, but that's a legislative question.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying if you're going to bother to go back to the legislature to get approval of a sales tax, would you broaden the use of that to cover sidewalks and greenways and things of that nature? Perhaps not roads, because there's another bucket you get your money out of there.
Yeah, that kind of discussion here, again, is probably why we draw the line between strategy and financial plan. Because you're correct, there's a lot of different ways that you could create combinations of things to get to that. We're going to show you a proof of concept here in a moment, which demonstrates how we can at least cover our portion of the local gap in the overall program. This next one, though, Kelly, will you walk us through? And Jim, you get credit for this, because we did a little bit of research based on some folks on the task force interest in the vehicle registration fee, as well as just generally others. We know that there are other mechanisms that we could be investing in.
Yeah, all last week, this is the Jim slide, so we'll sign and autograph it for you if you'd like a copy.
I hate to do this.
Sure.
I know you're ready to talk, but I think these questions may relate to what we've already gone through. So Ken and then Tammy.
City Council, I think they had I think it was an open discussion, might have been offline, but I think the City Council's mindset that they would not want to take on a tax increase without a referendum. Ty, is that not the feedback you got?
Yes, they said yes. This has to be positioned for. They were specific enough to say 2021 referendum. You are right.
Ken, the clarification on that is even if we got enabling legislation to allow us to increase. Well, they told me to speak into the mic so these other folks could hear.
A voice from heaven.
If we got enabling legislation, more than likely the legislation would require a referendum. And I don't think we'd be silly as a community not to put this before the community. So a referendum is built into this one.
As a matter of fact, you are not even. As a matter of fact, your federal and state partners will not take you serious if there's no local referendum. All these other communities we're competing with have taken that same step. So yes.
Yeah. Tammy?
Mr. Mayor, Ken had another comment. Ken had another comment.
Oh, Ken, I'm sorry.
Mayor, I was just saying that doesn't require a referendum. I just think they've agreed that it would be the right thing to do. And so they probably both would have to go, or they probably would both go referendum, even though one's not required. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Tammy?
Corporations and, you know, those of us who are just private citizens, is there any implication there that could help with the, you know, with what we are able to raise? And I just don't know the answer, so I was looking for clarification around that.
Sources we're contemplating right now, we would have the legal ability to charge different rates for different types of entities. Definitely not for property taxes. You couldn't charge a corporation a different rate than a resident. And I mean, sales tax is all based on usage, and I don't think you would have the ability to do that legally, and I don't even know how you would enforce it. I think that goes back to the question is there some sort of head tax you could charge to corporations? But to Ty's point, I think that was the flaw in Portland. We've seen a lot of other major cities eliminate the head tax because it drives business away. I know in Chicago in 2011 or 12, they eliminated it, and 2 and 3 years later, they saw more corporate relocations than they had ever seen in the prior term. And some of that was economic, but some of that was directly related to the head tax. So to answer your question, I don't think for the sources we're contemplating, it's something we could differentiate.
We'll see.
Oh, to the gym slide. So there was some confusion afterwards on what you were proposing, and I think we were talking past each other, so I just wanted to put together a slide, 1, to make sure that we were understanding each other, and 2, to remind people that there are other revenue sources out there, but as we keep saying, there's not enough squeeze in the juice in the squeeze, whatever the saying is. But this was just looking at an example of the city's vehicle tax fee, which is right now a $30 fee. It's at the statutory limit set by the state. For the city, that generates about $25 million a year, of which $25 goes to CATS for primarily maintenance of effort and operation of the Gold Line. $5 goes to the city's general fund. If we were to increase that fee by $1, $5, $10, you can see the math there. The point I was trying to make at our last meeting was you don't get a lot out of that 30, and the other components of a vehicle owner fee in a year is material. It's $185 in the average vehicle, and the city's $12,000. So if you want to just isolate the 30, it doesn't generate much. And if you want to jack up some of the other ones, those taxes aren't dedicated to transit right now. Doesn't mean they couldn't be, but I guess I'm challenged with kind of our principles of equity and fairness, and what is the line of what you should be charging for a vehicle fee. So that's where I was.
Jim, you want to comment on that?
So it may be a crazy what if, but I think part of the problem with the numbers is in this scenario, they're too low. So, meaning the fee increase is too low. So the vehicle fee today of $30, if we doubled that, that would, over a 30-year period, generate just shy of $1 billion. I know that sounds crazy. It's 780 million, I think is the math. And that may sound horrible to say, make it go from $184.55 to $210. But if we're trying to discourage driving in some cases, or get the people who are going to be driving regardless to help foot the bill, then I think the homes with 3 and 4 cars, instead of the ones that have 1 car, are going to be footing the majority of the bill. They're paying a higher fee or higher tax. They're the ones that are going to keep driving. So it was just a what if. You know, they could potentially bear a larger portion of that burden. And when you look at $1 and $5, I agree with you 100%. I just think if you're going to consider something like that, you got to say, what if it goes from 30 to 60 or 30 to 80 or something like that? Because we could generate $1 billion over 30 years that way.
Yeah, and to your point, there are cities that
You're an
fees
aggressive
60.
rounder, Jim.
No, if you go from 30 to 60.
750 million gets you to $1 billion?
Well, no, 750 million.
How much do you generate in 30?
Yeah,
So we get about 25 million a year.
780
So if
million.
we
Yeah,
doubled it.
you're right. It was an aggressive rounding. But my point is, it's still, okay, if we're talking $8 billion,
I get your
it's
point.
almost a tenth of the total cost. I'm not saying we should do it. I'm saying it's a legitimate thing, and there's a legitimate argument that it would tax the people that aren't going to be using what you're suggesting anyway.
You're putting a higher charge on the kind of thing that we want to do.
That you
which
want to
is
discourage.
Reduce the number of people driving cars to make trips on, and so you're making it a little bit more expensive. And you're adding a little something to the pot. But I think Kelly's point is that's not a substantial amount source of revenue
It's 1/10.
to deal with you get to 1/10? If you add how much?
If you double it,
If you went
Actually
to
get to $1 billion?
780 million, but in
780.
his mind, that's $1 billion.
700, well, no, of an $8 billion cost is 780 roughly 1/10. Yeah, okay, it's 1/11 or something, but yeah.
It's still something.
I'm just saying a what if.
No, I think
yeah.
when we look at the universe and we can do more research of the vehicle population in Charlotte, a lot of it's commercial vehicles. So those cars aren't going to go away. And are we comfortable? And we can try and cut the data and see if it's small business, large business, how much of it's residents. I don't think it addresses the issue. I don't think it leads to less cars. I think it just is because it's so much commercial vehicle, but we can take a look at it if you want.
It's sound economic principles. If you want people to do something less, there is a financial penalty for doing more of it, right? I mean, that's essentially the syntax, right? We did that with tobacco, right? The difference is, though, that fewer people smoked than didn't smoke. So it was easier from a policy perspective to advance that initiative. I think it's wise of us to take the counsel of what we're hearing, which is to say, we need to squeeze as much as we can, and let's squeeze appropriately those levers that tend to align with what we're trying to achieve. There is probably a point, if you were to talk to other communities, a point of diminishing return, right? If you were to take that fee too high, and we go to the voters, it might not be felt as well, like it might not be received as well. The question is, like, what's the Goldilocks zone? Where's the sweet spot with it? And I think to your point, looking at these, albeit smaller revenue streams, they become a responsible part of our recipe for success. The question is which of them are we selecting, to what rate we apply them, and that's one of those things I keep kind of falling on the side of. We need the detailed financing plan to embrace those principles and to figure out what package makes the sense to take to the voters, because almost all of this, to your point, Mr. Mayor, is something we need to gain the confidence and build a broad coalition of support for.
Betty.
Kelly, the county had a quarter-cent sales tax on the ballot that failed. Is that available, or is that the county's tax?
It is the counties. They could use it for this if they chose to.
Yeah, they could. Yes.
Got one on the web.
Nick has a question, and so is William.
Nick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A question for Kelly. When we're talking about the city vehicle fee, just to be clear, these are vehicles that have a address in Charlotte, North Carolina. So vehicles in Mint Hill or other 6 municipalities would not be impacted by this fee. They don't appear on their registration, and even though they're using our transit and resources, drive into the city limits every day, we wouldn't be able to pass this fee on. So this would be solely carried by residents that have a Charlotte address. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
Charlotte
thank you.
only.
Thanks, Nick. Ken?
Fee increase, $8 million. Does that contemplate that there's 880,000 cars in the city of Charlotte right now paying tax at $30 fee?
25 million. I think I saw a number somewhere where we have 600,000 vehicles. The reality is it's not everybody on the same, the first of the year getting the ticket, the decal, whatever you call that thing. So it's hard to say how many vehicles that actually is, but I think it's in the neighborhood of 500 to 600,000 cars.
Because you have that much your number from 7.8 to 6 billion. I mean, the devil's in the details. I just did the quick math, and I didn't think there'd be 880,000 cars in Charlotte.
William, yes. William?
So, thanks. So my comment basically, I think we mentioned this before in regards to how people discuss increases in taxes. And you see, they're not huge increases in taxes, but they are increases nonetheless. And how do people respond to that? And most people, I believe, most people, including myself, I speak for my family, we're willing to pay more when we understand the value proposition, including to a lot of presentations that we've seen thus far. A lot of us can translate the value proposition, but I don't think that it has to be, I think it can be in a very, very simple format in regards to when it's shared with the general public. And what I mean by that is that, the city council, upper mobility is front and center. We also want to utilize the quality of life score as well. And I think if you can translate a lot of the data that we've already seen into two simple scores, one would be upper mobility, and then two, and it could be multiple scores, but two that usually jump off the page is upper mobility and the quality of life score. And to be able to say, this is what you can anticipate as an average citizen in the city of Charlotte with this investment, this is what you can anticipate receiving in return. And if you can communicate it in those simple terms, I think people can understand it and say, okay, I like it, I don't. And, they can unpack it further if they choose to do so, but that's just my thought process. When we start talking about taxes, people run, and, I just don't think we do a very good job sharing what the benefit is in layman terms.
That's a very good point to be made, William. I agree with you that we have to make the case for why this network is going to be good in terms of equity, in terms of accessibility to jobs. And when you make that case, then you also then make the case of how we might finance it and allow citizens to react to that. And I believe, I think someone sent a comment in a while ago, I actually believe that next year when the council starts moving this ball down the road, they're going to have to look at an engagement process that identifies and clarifies to citizens what you really get. And you started that ball rolling, Stephen, earlier with these increases that you see in the network in terms of accessibility, the ability of people to access jobs and so forth and so on. That has to be a fine-grained process of reaching out to the community. Then they will evaluate, what is it that you need to take from me in order to see this vision? Now, let me just make this comment. I don't mean this to shut off discussion. What the staff is showing us is a sales tax, a property tax, and the impact of other fees that we might use. What I would call Jim's idea of charging more for automobiles to limit the use of automobiles on our streets and roads. There's a question as to whether it will really do that. But one of the things that I think is most important when you're going to a public of 1 million people or close to that, because we're going to assume this is going to be a countywide thing, is that you need clarity. I would hope the council, and it's their decision, we can only make a recommendation, but I would hope the council will understand that going to the public with a basket of tax options can confuse citizens' understanding of what it is. If they go with a sales tax and they say we can make that less regressive if the additional penny is not charged for groceries, for example, that impacts strongly the people at the lower end of the economic ladder if they don't have to pay that penny on every purchase they make. If they make some other declaration with regard to how they want to use that sales tax, the primary thing is to be clear on what it is and what the impact will be on the average citizen. And when that is made clear, then I think we have to do it. But I don't want us, and I don't mean this to cut off debate, but I don't want us to have a basket of options we are recommending to the city council, and then they choose from a basket that could cause some confusion. We need to think about the thing that's probably simplest, that raises the amount of money that we will need. And then if they wanted to come along later on and do something which I hope they wouldn't do, I hope they would not do, and come back and say, you know, we asked y'all for a penny and you gave it to us, but we really need to raise the property tax another 5 cents to cover some costs over here that we didn't anticipate. I hope they'll be true to their word and stick with one thing. That's why I'd like to see it as simple as possible. All right? Have I got some other comments? Yes. Carl?
I think he makes a good point. You saw it in my chat box there. I think we're all at this table tonight because we think that this transformation mobility network brings value to this community, to our neighbors, to ourselves. And this value generation can't be captured. These other cities are doing it because they're trying to be very proactive in attracting people to Austin, to Atlanta, to Gwinnett, to Nashville. And I remember back when the Little Steel Creek Greenway was just getting started, and when I was on this committee, and it was 2001, right after 9/11, and we were trying to figure out how do we pay for this Little Sugar Creek, and we came up with the economic benefits in terms of property values, in terms of jobs creation, in terms of new building, and we came up with a model that the payback model on greenways is about 7 to 10 years, and now I'm working with Florida Greenways in Florida, and the numbers can bear out that between 7 and 10 years, you pay back your investment on greenways, and after that, it's a cash cow, because you put in place the infrastructure that generates tax revenue. And that's businesses, that's sales tax, that's property values, that's people moving to this area that raise the value of property. So I think there's one way we're looking at how we fund this, but the other side of it is how much value are we generating by doing all this work to the people, the residents, and the visitors and future residents of Charlotte. And I think it's going to be, I think if you look at it from how much value are we creating in terms of property values and people wanting to move here in sales and businesses, I think we can make a case that these investments in capital pay for for themselves in a very small period of time, 5 to 7 years, which is unusual in a capital infrastructure type of program. So, I really like where William's going with this. We need to get the citizens involved in what is value to them and what are they willing to do. They spend a lot of money on things like going out to dinner, cell phones, movies, music streaming. Then we're not really talking a whole lot of money per resident here. So it's just my thought about looking at value creation rather than how we're going to pay for it, or in addition to how we're going to create it once we generate it. Thank
you. Eric?
I'm finally here, sorry. I had to drive to civilization to get internet. But I just wanted to take what Carl just said and Mayor, what you just said before about being simple and then how much it may cost or what value you get out of it. Austin, I looked at that. They were successful. They made 2 choices on the ballot. There's Prop A, Prop B. Prop A laid it out clearly, the property tax of 8.75 cents. That was only 75 cents a day, for an average resident. I gave the link in the chat. They broke it out depending on what your value is. There's exemptions with the homestead tax. I thought that was good for, equity and, under a certain dollar amount. And then the other one was a bond to pay for the rest. So the main point, property tax, simple, most bulk transit, and then the bonding referendum of $460 million for the rest of the modes. It was a pretty clear, simple choice laid out to the voters, and I think you got to repeat that same kind of framework there.
Thanks, Eric. Anybody else you got? All right. Okay, guys, go ahead.
One thing that we asked Kelly to do tonight, which is essentially if we keep using the analogy of we're buying a home and we need to take a loan, we need to demonstrate that we pre-qualify for that loan, right? We need to demonstrate that we could pay for this in some way. And so this is just a reminder of what our portion is. But Kelly has, and if you can go ahead and advance the slide for me, please. It's not allowing me to do so. The proof of concept is demonstrated here, and Kelly's going to walk us through. And I think what I want folks to realize is that this is nothing more than an example, right? And we could debate about, the final 5 or 10% of how we pay for it, but if we can't agree on the other 90%, then none of it matters. So we want to be sure that we can demonstrate that to you tonight. Kelly, would you walk us through this, please?
Sure. I think just a reminder, we keep saying it over and over, but we're not special, right? This is the same situation that every other major city has had to contemplate. And I think we're back to the big 2. And so this is just a summary of not trying to a quarter here, a dime here, and this gets me this, but just within the frame of rational thinking, can we get there? And like Stephen said, it's just a proof of concept. So it's taking the summary that we had from sales tax, where it's either a 0.25% or a full percent. That's going to generate between 55 and 220 million a year. Doesn't, again, assume any growth. And over that 30-year financing period, that's going to be between, I appreciate it's a very large gap, but $1.6 to $6.6 billion. And if we look at the dedicated property tax, again, 1 cent to 4 cents. It could be 10 cents. It could be 2 cents. Just showing within the band that we've come up with that could get between, again, just a city-only tax, 14 to 57 million annually, generating 420 to 1.7 billion over a 30-year financing period. And again, the other sources, whether that's a vehicle tax or if we find some sort of back to the advertisements that we were talking about in station and concession-esque revenue generators, but just looking at some form or fashion that could bring as little as 10 million. I think that's a super conservative low number in annually. Over 30 years, that's 300 million. So all in, we're looking at between 80 and 287 million a year, which would generate 2.3 to 8.6 billion. We know we're trying to solve for 4 to 6. There is a path to get to 4 to 6 with those three sources being contemplated. And back to Jim's original question about what do we have right now that we could repurpose? And I would argue it's not really a repurpose, but when we talk about that 4 to 6 number, within that 4 to 6 is about 500 million over the 10-year construction period of existing capital improvement bonds. So that's the referendum that was voted on last week, which feels like years ago now. So that would be a portion of that. So you could almost take the 4 to 6 and take off 500 because, you know, we kind of assume that in the plan already, if that made sense.
Does that does seem to me that you're telling me in the CIP budget we've got $500 million.
Well, we don't plan
Over
that
10
far
years.
out. We only plan the CIP for 5 years.
years.
And then the referendum we do every 2 years. So you saw on the ballot $100 million transportation revenue. We just kind of cut that in half and called it 50. I think the exact
But
number
what
was
I really wanted
102.
to say was that does that transportation, are those projects, projects that fit into the transformational?
Yeah, so for the 2022 plan that we haven't populated that yet, but it would include a portion of the projects that's in that 4 to 6 number.
Like roads, like bikeways,
Potholes, paving, yeah.
paving,
A little something for
sidewalks.
everybody.
sidewalks.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Yes, Betty?
That is already in the plan, which is
So our gap is somewhere between 3.5 to 7.5. Right?
Yeah.
Take out that $500 million.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate again, these numbers don't assume any growth in revenues. It doesn't assume any property revaluations, which obviously property is going to appreciate over a 30-year time period. And again, we can continue to do due diligence on the other sources, but I don't think there's a one that generates enough. And I always go back to Ty. I don't know. The first thing they teach you in public finance is make it relatable to people. And Ty seems to be relatable. And I don't have kids, but here's my example anyways. 6 daughters or 7 daughters? How many you got now? 6?
Okay.
So
we're gonna do
would you rather each one of your 6 daughters come up every single day and ask you for lunch money, gas money, movie money, or would you rather just give them $100 at the beginning of every week? And that's what it equates to. Do you want to get nickeled and dimed, or do you just want to knock this out and move on? Is kind of how I look at it. And I've seen it. I've been around 20 years. I've seen it done both ways. And when it comes time to pay the bill, people remember every single fee that you put on them. So.
And that is very true. Like I said earlier, there's only so many times you can go and draw from the well. And if you know this is the vision, this is what we're asking for, then it is what it is. But I'd like you to pay attention to this slide again. You notice that even the other sources, like motor vehicle registration, will still require some type of state authority. And the less you require from the state, the better you are positioned. And then you notice that the dedicated property tax, it could also be subject to referendum. I know Ken brought that up earlier, but it could also be because right now we do go every 2 years for bonds, and we just did one. Next time is 2022. If we were to go for a referendum in 2021, do we pull that back into 2021 and not go again? And those are the ways. It sounds complex. Someone taught me something about transit referendums a long time ago. If the answer cannot fit on a car sticker, you're likely going to lose. I mean, the message can't fit on a car sticker, you're likely going to lose. No is very easy. It's the yes that's tough. And if it's multiple, I just think we've got to just find a way to message it that one car sticker can tell a yes message without it being 2 lines on it. I don't have an answer to it, but I think that the less we go to the state, the better. The more we can package something together so that we don't have to go over time, the better we are.
So this was a really important exercise for us to do, right? Up until now, we've been just a lot of talk, a lot of mapping, a lot of we want to do good, right? We want to ensure that we're future-proofing our economy, that we're ready for the challenges not only exist today, but those that are trending. And so this is helpful. But I also want to remind everyone what Kelly has reinforced with us, that we don't get to make all those decisions, right? That was a proof of concept. It's an example. It's not what we should aspire to recommend, because we know that council has to weigh a lot of competing interest. They also have to contemplate our bond ratings, things like that go beyond and transcend this particular task force. So it's a big undertaking. Kelly's work has just begun. You're welcome, Kelly. But we do need to make a recommendation. And so at some point, we need to contemplate the level of detail for that. But I want to bring us back home to this final slide, which is essentially reminding you of the 3 pillars of what's in a funding strategy. And the ingredients are: you need to communicate your time and duration, your program scale and amount, and your likely funding sources. I feel like we're getting pretty close. The question is whether or not is the task force reaching a comfort level with which to articulate that as a recommendation to the mayor, to council, and to the city manager. Our time and duration, 10 plus years, financing over 30. The Transformational Mobility Network is our program at a total cost of $8 to $12 billion, with our local portion being 4 to 6. And our funding sources likely to have 2 categories: primary and existing, supplemented by partnerships. Our primary would be transit sales tax, dedicated property tax. Our partnerships clearly are state and federal, and our existing sources are planned capital investments. I think the one nuance tonight is, should we also include that there is some other category? We've demonstrated that it can play a role. But I think that's one of those questions that I think we could demonstrate to council, that there are other sources. They'll likely get us to a certain level, but allow them to apply the wisdom of making the decisions about what to include, but show the math so that they understand the influence of that. I leave you with this, not because this is where we need to conclude, but it's maybe the launch point for our next meeting, where hopefully we'll do a decent job at representing what we're hearing thus far by way of some kind of set of recommendations that will speak to all of these in a little bit greater detail. With that, Mayor, that's the end of our presentation.
Yes, Sonia.
I just kind of wanted to quick back out here. Kiva said a little earlier there was a slide that was shown all of the different cities looking at that half-cent tax, and a point that was made that we haven't made an adjustment in 20 years. Could probably use that as a selling point.
Okay.
Bill Cox.
Bill?
Going way back early in the presentation to the results of the referendum, I believe it was Austin that included $300 million to offset simplification reports. Is that an accurate statement, Mike?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County and all participating jurisdictions have had adopted a policy now for 20 years what we're trying to accomplish. Finally, the state legislature is going to have to support us in anything that will raise $2 million. And I was hoping for every legislative outcome in this election, and I don't think we got it. But it's everywhere. Thanks.
Well, I'm not going to make any predictions about how the city is going to do in the legislature, but I will echo a lot of what you just said, Bill. I do think that there are other competing interests, and one of the advantages of this task force is that we have been singularly focused on mobility. And I think we've got to give a recommendation that stays within those parameters, singularly focused on mobility. The job of the council and the mayor is going to be, how does that stack up against other priorities that we have in the city? That's not our task, and I'm not going to sit and worry about what those other priorities are, because that's a waste of time, and that's not what our charge was. But we did look at everything from equity to convenience to all the things I think that we were required to look at. And now we're also looking at what would you say to this body would be the best way forward on financing this system. And we need to understand that whatever we ultimately agree on as a task force does not necessarily mean that the city council, which has to weigh so many other things, may agree on. But I want the decision that we make to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Sensible, fiscally responsible, at least from the perspective we're looking at it, and something that the citizens of the community, from our perception of where they are, might not find to be unreasonable. The task force is made up of a cross-section of this community. You need to look at that question. If it's the property tax, what does 4 cents do? And I think they've tried to lay some of that out to you, and I'm going to ask you in preparation for the next meeting for you to study those elements of the property tax. If it's a sales tax, we need to look at that. We need to look at how responsibly we've used the sales tax over the 22 years that it's been in existence. We never tried to change it, and it basically financed, and the public, I think, will agree with us, it basically financed the light rail system such as we have today. So if we're being transformational, does it not make sense that we've had good experience with that to examine that very closely? And I can see for some of the other things that the property tax competes. Council might be very concerned about adding 2 cents to the property tax when they do have other things they've got to look at, parks and whatever, what have you. So for the next meeting, does everybody have a copy of these slides, Ty?
We will send this out to everyone tonight.
Okay. And in the next meeting?
November 18th.
We're going to be seeing, what, a draft of this? And
yes.
Indicate that when we gather again, this is becoming frequent for us, on November 18th, we'll gather again and discuss a set of task force recommendations. We're going to do our best to craft a draft set of recommendations. We're not going to get it 100% right. That's the reason you're here. So we're going to focus our conversation on necessary revisions, maybe think about some conditions we want to add, policy recommendations, if you will. By December 3rd, we will have a final meeting with which to review the recommendations and report. So we're going to package this up in a way that's meaningful to people beyond those who were able to attend every meeting. And that's important because ultimately I think that council is going to be looking to their constituents for what do they think about this prior to weighing in. Obviously, we're going to include a series of public comment and input, Mayor Gantt, during that meeting, even beyond probably what we have done in the past, with the hope of ultimately working towards the delivery of this recommendation to council on December 14th. And so we'll need to talk a little bit more about what format that takes.
We'll have time to do that. We'll have time to do that. So it means that just before Thanksgiving, we're going to have another meeting. You need to come, and I'm hoping, we've been getting good attendance, both virtually and otherwise, and I'm hoping we will have 100% attendance. As to whether it will be in person as we are tonight, or whether or not we will do it virtually, Ty will let you know in time where that's going to go. But you've always been a really hard at work task force. We need to think about what that recommendation ought to be, particularly on the funding side. I think the council has got a glimpse of what the transformational mobility network is going to be about, and they're excited about that. I think the most serious thing that we're going to do is that they're going to take into account what we recommend as a funding strategy going forward. And we're going to get closer to that in these recommendations. I almost think those first two things you're going to do are going to be pretty much accepted. I think the fight's not fight, but the debate is going to be, how does the average citizen receive this information of what it's going to cost me for the next 30 years? It's interesting, when I've been around that long, one of those people who got involved in the half-cent sales tax for this. And I had all the doom and gloom reports about how this is going to just beat poor people down, and we just this, that, and the other. And we kept trying to paint a more positive picture of what the future was going to look like, and that this was just the beginning of the network. And it passed. I think they had the number up, and it got challenged. And I think we had to do it a second time because people thought that it was terrible. It didn't help that we had cost overruns and all kinds of things that made people think that we don't want to go that direction. But I shudder to think, if that referendum on the second time around had lost, how far behind we would be with regard to light rail in this city and transportation in general. I just think our competitor cities would have gone way ahead of us. So the council is going to have to realize that this is a transformational moment for them in terms of how they want to proceed with this. We need to examine what that impact might be on our fellow citizens, and particularly those who are living on the margins in the city, and whether or not they can stand to do that. Okay. We have some public comments that came in.
Yes, I know we are running behind.
Over time.
But there's just a couple of them I'll read quickly. One comment is Deborah Franklin. She just read an article about why Gwinnett lost by 1,000 votes, and said one voter voted against it because it did not help our community. Again, that goes back to what we said earlier. People need to see themselves in it. In consulting, we call it WIFM, what's in it for me. That's really the most important thing for many people. From Ms. Abigail Williams, asking if this plan is for 2040 or 2050. One of the slides said that this is something we can build out in 10 plus years, but the financing plan is for a period of 30 years. And then the last comment from Ms. Kristen Dennis was just really talking about, this is a great conversation. Let's consider leveraging resources and transportation and transit, parks and greenways with the county to support the transformation and mobility network. So thank you very much for your comments. We appreciate that.
Thank you. And with that, the meeting is adjourned, and you will hear from Ty as to where we will do it or how we will do it for the meeting. I'm sorry, Sonia, did you have a comment?
But I think Ty needs to be recognized. He can you tell what he was in? He had in a magazine. Come on, toot your horn.
Yes, I saw his.
Yeah, let everybody know.
I will do the honors of embarrassing Ty, who was recognized by Charlotte Magazine as one of the Charlotteans of the Year. And the fun part of that is, yeah, a round of applause. That makes sense. Congratulations.
Thank you.
He joins the good company of folks like Michael Jordan, so kind of a big deal. Thanks for the contribution, Ty.
Very good. Very good.
I've never dunked a basketball in my life, but I'll take that. Thank you.
That's great news. Well, thank you again for your attendance and your continued attendance over the period of these meetings. We really appreciate it. I want you to know the mayor, as you know, appreciates it so much. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.